All right, so our next speaker is Sami Tayub on Epistemic Modality, accounting for the metaphysical underdetermination of science.
Hi, so my talk's on just trying to resolve the metaphysical underdetermination of science. So what is the metaphysical underdetermination of science? So this is when we have like multiple metaphysical theories that are compatible with the observable phenomena science discovers. So we can have like universals or tropes, and they all seem compatible with the properties science discovers. But also we can say time, for instance, does time have a direction? Kind of we either say it doesn't or it doesn't. That both seems compatible with contemporary physics, especially. The classic metaphysicians response is to appeal to extra-empirical virtues. So which metaphysical theory is a better explanation of the phenomena? So we kind of which one's more consistent, which one's simpler, and so on. But the empiricist response is typically that explanatory power is not truth conducive. And so we, in principle, cannot know which metaphysical theory is true because there's no way to choose between them. And this is most popularly kind of held by Fraassen in his kind of lots of papers. This is kind of what dominated his kind of empiricist philosophy of science from the scientific image. So my response to Fraassen is that I argue that we can use the empirical content of scientific theories to test metaphysics. And we can do this by characterizing metaphysical theories in terms of models. So those metaphysical theories which can account for science's empirical content are epistemically possible, and those which cannot are epistemically impossible. And this overcomes the underdetermination challenge because at worst we can narrow down the possible ways reality might be. We don't just have to be agnostic. And at best, we even have a pathway to what the ultimate account of reality might actually be as our empirical content grows. And the important thing is that there's no appeal to explanatory power because this is a criticism on Fraassen's terms. So avoids that concern from Fraassen. So Fraassen is one of the most prominent contemporary critics of metaphysics. So in the empirical stance in 2002, that houses his most famous polemic, but it's all the way from the scientific image, he's always held this. And even in his book, Quantum Mechanics, where he shows this kind of underdetermination across different quantum mechanical issues, he urges us to bid goodbye to metaphysics. Now, it's very common that people say that Fraassen is completely limited about metaphysics and we shouldn't do it. But that doesn't seem quite right. So consider this quote from Fraassen himself. So he says, "I submit that the empiricist response, in fact, opens up an area of philosophical inquiry where realists and empiricists can work in a collaboration equally valuable to both sides. For when we analyze the scientific image as a representation, all those questions posed in ontology do arise, such as questions about substance, individuation, causality, and haexiety, but in a new key. They are not just verbally the same questions, for the concepts used belong to the same conceptual framework drawn from metaphysics." So from this we can see, and Fraassen used this quote quite a lot, that Fraassen does indeed kind of have this big role for metaphysics within his empiricist philosophy of science, which is going to surprise some. So what is Fraassen's view? So Fraassen argues the empiricist should be agnostic about metaphysical knowledge. And this follows from his broader agnosticism about unobservables, because he argues, and despite this, he argues that metaphysical theories which are used to interpret science have pragmatic value. Specifically, these metaphysical theories inform us about the way reality might be, where the scientific theory it is interpreting was true. Now, Fraassen famously argued that the empiricist does not need to believe in the truth of scientific theories. So he doesn't really believe that any of these metaphysical theories tell us about the way reality might be, and these aren't genuine possibilities. So how does he get to this picture? So for Fraassen, scientific theories make claims about both observables and unobservables, and this comes from his semantic realism. And scientists' claims about observables are that which we can in principle observe, can be empirically tested because we can make experiments which reproduce those observables which the scientist predicts. Now, claims about unobservables, however, there's no way to empirically test them because they're unobservable. So we have to rely on explanatory power and then make an inference to best explanation by saying, those unobservables we posit are the best explanations, so that's why they're true. But since Fraassen is critical about appeals to explanatory power to kind of get to the truth, he thinks that we should be agnostic about claims about unobservables. Therefore, Van Fraassen recommends that empiricists need only commit to the empirical adequacy of science, so its truth about claims about observables, not its whole truth. So how does this connect to metaphysics? So for Van Fraassen, highlights that the assertion of empirical adequacy is a great deal weaker than truth, and the restraint to acceptance delivers us from metaphysics. So he identifies metaphysics with the unobservable. So its epistemic warrant is delivered by appeals to explanatory power, and that's exactly what the metaphysician wants. So for example, Lowry, Paul, and so on. And Van Fraassen argues that this leads us to reject metaphysical realism because there cannot be, in principle, convergence to a single story about our world. Because for Van Fraassen, there is no way to know if metaphysical theories are converging on the truth because they're unobservables. So we have to rely on explanatory power, which is not truth-conducive. And since we have growing underdetermination as well, that means there's no way of knowing if our metaphysics are kind of grabbing onto something. But where does metaphysics explicitly kind of manifest in science for Van Fraassen? So we have to go to like what Van Fraassen thinks of as scientific theories. So for Van Fraassen, scientific theories are families of models. And these theories can provide true claims about observables when these models can be used to predict models of experimental data. Yeah, and then when they can do that, then it can provide true claims about observables. So for instance, Newtonian mechanics, its models kind of obey the laws of motion, obeys his laws of motion. And we can use these models to predict a model of the solar system, and that's accurate, so it's empirically adequate. But Van Fraassen also believes these family models can include extensions, and extensions are models which go beyond the empirical content of the current theory. So they can be put in the advantageous position of offering modeling possibilities when radically new phenomena come to light. So even though Van Fraassen is critical of metaphysics, he still sees there's kind of this room even within scientific theories, and even calls them metaphysical baggage. So to make precise what he means, I argue we can think of these extensions as metaphysical models, and these were introduced by Paul Godfrey Smith in 2006 and Lowry Paul in 2012. So Lowry Paul explicitly states a metaphysical theory can be understood as a class of models, where the models are composed of logical, modal, and other relations relating variables that represent n-addict, properties, objects, and other entities. Godfrey Smith argues metaphysical models are highly schematic and not strongly guided by desire for an exact fit to empirical data, but for the generation of some important class of behaviors which may be of the right kind to be discovered later. And this fits the criteria Van Fraassen uses to define extensions, because they're metaphysical and they posit further phenomena. So I mean, this all sounds kind of strange that Van Fraassen would include metaphysical models within his science theories. So here's an example of Van Fraassen himself doing this. So Van Fraassen showed that a metaphysical theory of three models of Reichenbach's common cause principle can be used to derive Bell's inequalities, which have of course been observed to be violated in a Nobel Prize winning award. So in this metaphysical theory of the common cause, Van Fraassen uses argues causes are bound to be factorizable, so this is a statistical constraint. They're local, so causes have to be next to each other in space and time. And there is no superdeterminism, so the experimenter's choices don't determine the experiment's results. And there's no extra-causality, so causes have to precede effects. Now, the critical thing is these are all clearly metaphysical concerns about determinism and locality, are all obviously kind of metaphysical, and causality is especially so, as we showed in the earlier quote. And the reason why is because it's inherently unobservable. And this is kind of even the Humean point, that causality, we just can't observe causation, and that's why it's unobservable. And we can't observe determinism, we can't observe locality. But we can use these models to derive Bell's inequalities according to Van Fraassen, and we can even vary the unobservable claims this metaphysical theory makes to kind of lead to different predictions. So, for example, we can say that you can have non-local causes, and this won't predict the Bell's inequalities, and the Hassok, Chang, and Nancy Cartwright showed this. Hofstede-Szabo and Reddy and Hofstede-Szabo also showed that if we have weak no conspiracy constraints, then we can also not predict the observed violation of Bell's inequalities. And Hossenfeld and Palmer showed that if we have a superdeterministic model of reality that's local, we can also not predict the Bell's inequalities. Now, why is this significant? So each of the metaphysical theories just shown seems to qualify as extensions because they each model future phenomena, so the violation of Bell's inequality or not. And they also model further phenomena, so locality, superdeterminism, and so on. But for the scientific theory to be empirically adequate, that is, for its account of observables to be true, it cannot seem to include empirically inadequate metaphysical models. This is because the scientific theory's account of observables can only be true if this theory is not constituted by empirically inadequate models, since what these models say about the observable parts of reality are false. And this is kind of obvious. If you want a scientific theory to have an accurate account of reality, then it can't have models which produce kind of accounts of observables that are obviously false. So only empirically adequate metaphysical models can extend and hence constitute empirically adequate scientific theories. Therefore, Van Fraassen's metaphysical theory cannot form part of quantum theory because quantum theory won't be empirically adequate then. Now, why is this significant? Because if empirically inadequate metaphysical models cannot constitute scientific theories so that it can be empirically adequate, then I argue these metaphysical models are false. Because a science theory can only make specific claims about the observable that are true if it does not make specific claims about the unobservable, which are then false, as described by those empirically inadequate models. So, for example, quantum theory can only posit the observed violations of Bell's inequalities if it does not posit a causal order of reality as per the metaphysical theory that Van Fraassen used for M123. And if the former is true, which the empiricist commits, then the latter must be false. And the empiricists can't just maintain their agnosticism about metaphysics here, because then they'd have to be agnostic about the observables that quantum theory produces. And since we kind of do observe the observed violations of Bell's inequalities, it seems really led to skepticism because we have to be agnostic about that which we actually do observe. So, what about the empirically adequate metaphysics then? So, empirically adequate metaphysical models can be models of a scientific theory, but that doesn't mean we can infer them to be true, as Van Fraassen shows, because they're just other models of scientific theories that we're agnostic about. However, Van Fraassen states that you can think of the models of a scientific theory as representing the possible worlds allowed by the theory. But Van Fraassen posits these worlds because these extensions model possible future phenomena. And as is well known post-positivism, a scientific theory can only posit and hence describe observables using the theoretical terms of that theory, which also then refer to unobservables because of Van Fraassen's semantic realism. So, if a model of a scientific theory posits observable phenomena, then that phenomena has to be described using theoretical terms that thus refer to possible unobservables. But it is surprising that an empiricist permits modal claims or even posits possible worlds. This is why Van Fraassen clarifies that these models are possibilities relative to the truth of scientific theories, which the empiricist is agnostic about, so we're agnostic about these possibilities. However, as I've just shown, the models of a science theory are constrained by its empirical adequacy, what we observe. Since these models correspond to possible worlds, observation not only constrains the models a science theory consists of, but also the possibilities it posits. Because only empirically adequate metaphysical models can form part of scientific theories. And so, since the models of science theory correspond to possible worlds, that means empirical adequacy constrains those possible worlds. And given that the empiricist accepts that we can know the truth of the theory's empirical content, these possibilities are constrained by what we know. And that's just what epistemic possibilities are. They're possibilities relative to knowledge. In this case, the knowledge is what we observe in an experimental setting. So therefore, these metaphysical models appear epistemically possible if and only if they are empirically adequate. If not, then it is false that reality could be this way relative to what we observe. But what are epistemic possibilities? So epistemic possibilities are possibilities relative to some knowledge. So I get this from Chalmers. And this contrasts objective possibilities, which are possibilities relative to some truths. And this is an important contrast to make in the literature because Ladyman Ross and Morganti and Taco both want to say they're objective possibilities. Which I don't want to say. And the reason is because what we know expresses some ignorance about what we know to be what is true. So different objective modalities can be subsumed by a broader epistemic modal space because what we know allows for different accounts of what may be true. So different epistemic possibilities posit different what could be true from what we know. And this is useful in the current debate because what we know, the empirical content of science, does not prefigure a true metaphysic because that is underdetermined. So we can allow for different accounts of what might be true in this epistemic modal space. So my conclusion is that this means the nature of epistemic analyses means that we don't have to prefigure what is true, but as our experimental findings grow, we can narrow it down and we can have some convergence to a single story about our world, contra Van Fraassen. This illustrates the metaphysical underdetermination of science is tractable, since the empirical content of science can be used to test and hence narrow down metaphysical theories. So, for example, the observed violation of Bell's inequalities narrows down the epistemic possible ways of reality might be, because Van Fraassen's metaphysical theory can be ruled out. but all the other empirically adequate ones, which can account for the observed violations of Bell's inequalities, can be included. So at worst, we can narrow down the possible ways reality might be, but at best, a pathway to an ultimate account of nature is illuminated, because as our experimental findings grow, we could narrow down to the ultimate one. So yeah, that's all. Thank you.
That was some nice piece of metaphysical work. Any questions?
Yes, I was just kind of thinking about what you were presenting and what just I presented just before your presentation, and also to that to Tahko and Morganti paper that both of us referred to, because I was wondering that is there a kind of analogy here between positions in philosophy of science and in metaphilosophy. I think that that's one of these kind of big themes of this conference, because what you were saying, kind of, if you look from it from enough distance, it sounds a lot like Popper, that you have this kind of metaphysical theory that kind of leads to certain kind of conclusions, which then can be falsified by experiment, but experiment itself leads a lot of open options. I had this kind of strong incommensurability and kind of meta-theoretical reasoning. If you look at Morganti and Tahko, they have, I'd say they have pretty, or Paul, they have pretty standard abduction or inference to the best explanation. I was just kind of wondering that how this kind of, would you say that this kind of mapping onto these kind of different possibilities, or the comparison of your view with Popper's, would it kind of be fair?
Yeah, thanks for that. So I mean, the combination between mine and Morganti and Taco's is that Morganti and Taco want to say that each of these possibilities are objective possibilities, and they have this essence base, which I deny because the nature of objective modality is underdetermined for me. So we can have structural, or we don't even need, we can have Humean ones as well, and they can all be epistemically possible for me. Whereas for Taco and Morganti, well, Morganti I think changes view, by the way, but definitely for Taco, he's gonna want a kind of an essence base for his possibilities, which I don't require because I'm having epistemic possibilities. So there is kind of a similarity with Popper, but I don't have a criteria for falsifiability. I'm just saying that if we kind of make these as metaphysical models, and if there is empirical content that can be embedded, then we can think of these as epistemic possibilities. And if they're kind of empirically indeterminate, then I'm kind of agnostic about whether they're epistemically possible, and we can just say they're logically possible, which might be unsatisfying. But yeah, that's why I want to go with that. Yeah, thanks.
Any more questions?
So sorry for this kind of simple question, that speaking as a physicist, if I think of like the standard model of particle physics that is compatible with experiments, and then there are various extensions that are compatible with the standard model, but also predict new particles, which are maybe seen in some future experiments. Are these examples of empirically adequate metaphysical models?
Oh yeah, that's interesting. So for me or for Van Fraassen, or do you not mind? Well, I mean, for me, so the way I think about it, I just think metaphysics and science are kind of like the same thing. That a lot of science kind of contains metaphysical models. So for instance, in Newtonian mechanics needs absolute space, and absolute space is kind of like meant to be like this like this kind of this kind of paradigm case of a metaphysical model, or kind of metaphysics. And so that kind of form parts of it. When it comes to the standard model, are these particles metaphysical? I don't think so, because I mean they can't be directly observed. I mean they kind of you'd want to directly observe those particles from standard model, right? Whereas in metaphysics, you kind of in principle can't observe them. So you can't observe absolute space, for instance. You can't observe causation because there's no way of observing causation. But yeah, ultimately, I think like the distinction between metaphysics and science is blurred. But I think in the case of like the particles and standard model, it's probably definitely going to be science than metaphysics, because it's something we can directly observe. So.
All right. Any more questions?
Yeah, thanks. That was very, very clear. Can you please put on the final slide? This one. Yeah, thanks. So, okay, perhaps one conclusion is, or the kind of moderate is, that this kind of some kind of restriction on metaphysical theories, but it doesn't decide which metaphysical theory is correct or true one. And this is based on, or basically physics, to put things in a simpler manner. Okay, that sounds very plausible and good, but then we have this interesting phenomenon in metaphysics that even Aristotelian hylomorphism is defended ingenuously, I would say. So it's not kind of obvious that even though it seems to be kind of violating this weak restrictions, still it's not obvious that it's out of the game, so to speak. I'm not an Aristotelian metaphysician, but still this is an interesting phenomenon, and just a thought that I don't know what's going on actually here, because I emphasize that it's not obvious that it's out of the game, so to speak. Do you get at all what I'm speaking about?
I mean, is the worry that that hylomorphism hasn't been like fully refuted by science?
Or perhaps it is, but
still
it can be ingeniously defended in metaphysics by some people nowadays.
I mean, so James Ademan is one of my supervisors, and I mean, what he would say is that this is what's wrong with metaphysics nowadays. And I don't want to be. I think he's kind of right. I mean, like in that case, if it's like so obviously wrong, I mean, if it's so obviously in conflict. But the thing is, what I think what James wants to say is that we shouldn't do Aristotelian metaphysics full stop then. Whereas I'm going to say, if we can make it empirically, if we can make it compatible with the science, then I think it's fine. Like if there's ways to wait for a revision to do a metaphysical theory such that it is kind of compatible. I don't know if those hylomorphists are doing that.
Perhaps, as far as I can see, they're trying to do that. And so, yeah, I'm more sympathetic to your view, but still, this is just something that kind of wonders me, why it is still so that they can still kind of ingeniously defend kind of a contemporary version of Aristotelian hylomorphism, given all this.
I mean, this is one of the things that James says to me, is that this is the problem with metaphysics, is that it's never really empirically kind of, it can never really be empirically adequate, because you can always just add a kind of another assumption, or you can just deny another assumption just to make it empirically adequate. And that's why, it can never be kind of fully empirically adequate. But I think as long as you have some kind of constraint, then I think it's fine. But yeah, as long as kind of we're constraining the metaphysics in some way, I think it's fine.
Any more questions?
Very nice presentation. I'm a complete layman, so forgive me for this, but I'm searching for two key terms here. One is linear time and one is perception. How do they work in this framework of yours?
So sorry, I mean, what about linear time? What's the?
Well, you don't speak about time hardly at all. Yet you mentioned that you talk about quantum phenomena, for example, but you don't specify who is perceiving and from what kind of a time dimension? What do you have to say about time and perception?
I'm not really too sure, to be honest. Yeah, I don't really have an answer to that. I don't really know.
Okay.
Thanks, Sami. I'm going to kind of echo a question that Yanni asked to another talk earlier, which is that for certain kind of metaphysical topics, kind of what we might broadly think of as the cluster of things involved in the metaphysics of science, causes, laws, maybe emergence, levels of reality, natural kind, so on and so forth. The kind of optimistic conclusion here seems quite convincing, right? That, yeah, I kind of like this idea. But then what about kind of very different metaphysical type questions, like the difference between being an existence or free will, or kind of what ontological category theory to adopt or something like that? Do you think the kind of stuff you've talked about here can also apply in those cases? And if not, what does that tell us about those kind of debates?
Yeah, good. I'm really not sure. It's a difficult question. I mean, would you classify them as metaphysical concerns? As in, I mean, yeah, free will would be a metaphysical concern, wouldn't it? I mean,
On ontological categories, definitely. I think, kind of metaphysics par excellence. I guess James would say, get rid of them. Right?
yeah.
If you can't even touch them with something like this, just.
I mean, metaphysical. I mean, he needs structure though, so.
But he does, yeah.
I mean, if it's case like, I mean, metaphysical categories, I think probably can be empirically adequate because we've ruled out kind of some forms of Humean supervenience because they can't account for entanglement relations. But then it's like there's more difficult questions of like free will. I'm not too sure, but a lot of people take a lot of quantum mechanics to kind of apply to free will. So maybe it can. I mean, there are just kind of inherently more difficult ones that you just can't. But I feel like general questions of like ontology, causation, I think emergence and natural kinds, I feel like they all can be. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, yeah, it kind of depends how you're going to define metaphysics. But if they're not metaphysics, then what is? I mean, yeah, that's a good point. So yeah, thanks.
And on those notes, we end the final session of the day and thank our speaker once again.